The truth, however, is that the revelation of Christ stands on its own with no connection to sin, to Adam, to the devil, to Jesus' death, or to any of the other negative ideas man has hung on Christ. What could have been less of a surprise to God than man's sinning? After all, God is the one who created man with this possibility, with free will, that is. As Tertullian said, sin is man's second nature. Actually, no one can offend God. Man offends himself and his neighbor. And who can make sense of the idea God must atone to God, i.e. the Logos God, atone to the Father God? Did God atone to itself? If someone offended you, how could you atone to yourself? The notion one God atones to another God is mythical polytheism. The Incarnation was the most gracious act God ever did for man, and to connect it with sin, evil, God's wrath, God's need to be pacified or atoned to, is an abominable myth. This is not the good news of Christ. This is blasphemy. The only people who had it right are those who affirmed Christ would have come whether man had sinned or not. To make the incarnate Christ dependent on man's sins, as if Christ were an afterthought, is man taking credit for Christ. To make Christ dependent on Adam's fall or man's sins means that if man had not sinned, there would be no Christ. According to Duns Scotus, to make Christ totally dependent on Adam's sinning is to reduce Christ to the servant of fallen man. For Scotus, the purpose of the Incarnation was not as a means to redeem man from sin. Rather, Christ was the bridge, the medium between the created and uncreated, revealed so all would know the Lord of all creation. He said, quote, "Man was created because of Christ. Christ was not created because of man. We were made for Christ. Christ was not made for us. The Incarnation was not God's, quote, afterthought," end quote. Gregory of Nazianzus also points out, quote, "If Christ was only incarnate for our sake, then we are greater than he, more important to God than he, because Christ would only exist for us," end quote. He scoffs, quoting again. Who would maintain such a thing? If the Logos was only brought forth so God could create me, then I am of more worth to God than the Logos. That would make me far worthier than the celestial Christ, if Christ were made for me, end quote. Hilary of Poitiers, quote, "He had no need of becoming man, for it was he who made man. But we had need that God should become flesh and dwell in us, that he should assume one body of flesh and thus dwell in all flesh. Since he is God in the flesh, we are renewed from the flesh unto God," end quote. Like Athanasius, Hilary makes scarcely any distinction between what is true of Christ and what is true of all Christians. Quote, I guess this is a Hilary. "God gains nothing by our assumption, taking us into himself. God loses none of his divinity, while man is enabled to become God. What is essential is the continuity that joins the head and the members, causes the glories of the head to pass into the members, and affects the collective divinization of human nature by virtue of the singular union of the Logos with its humanity," end quote. That Christ would have come even if man had not sinned was also the view of Clement of Alexandria, Theodore of Mapuestia, and, I believe, Methodius. Irenaeus sums it up, quote, "Christ came out of love, not out of pity, mercy, sin, or any other reason." A thought for you to consider, perhaps this is a more beautiful idea for the purpose of the Incarnation than atonement of sin. As noted previously, Duns Scotus held that human nature has always had the capacity to be assumed by the divine Logos, and that everyone's human nature can be united to or assumed by the Logos, become Christ, that is. Thus, quote, Christ's human nature is the same as every other human nature. Christ's human nature has a passive potency for assumption, being united to God. We know this factually since Christ's human nature is assumed. The passive potencies and liabilities of a nature are essential features of it, not accidental features. The passive potency for assumption had by Christ's human nature is thus essential and therefore shared by all human natures. All human natures have a passive potency for assumption, thus no human nature can possess a feature that is sufficient to block assumption. In short, every human being is potentially set up to be assumed by the Logos, become the Logos' own human nature, no different than Christ. The truths that the Incarnation was intended to reveal far outreach any narrow dogmatic interpretation. Man may never be able to fully understand or fathom all it was intended to reveal. For sure, its purpose was never to reveal the person Jesus, who never existed prior to his birth in Bethlehem. All that God intended to reveal through him was beyond him completely. Indeed, God's plan for one's own life is never what he thinks it is. Not only is God's plan beyond man's comprehension, but God is the only one that can carry it out anyway, despite man. The Incarnation, then, was not God creating some human being, but God creating man's common human nature for itself alone. God did not become human, but without any change in its uncreated existence, God established a unique, eternal union between its divine essence and the essence of human nature. We stress unique because it was a oneness utterly different than anything God had created before or after. This is a oneness beyond creation's natural or existential oneness with God, and beyond any union with God man can experience in this life, such as a mystical union or theosis. As to the true nature of this unique oneness, or how God brought it about, that mystery is Christ. We might summarize the purpose of the Incarnation as God's revealing the truth of man to man. While every revelation of God is the revelation of truth itself, in the annals of human history, however, the Incarnation is the sole revelation of God that includes man. Thus, its primary revelation is all man means to God, his ultimate destiny and eternal oneness with God. It is also the revelation of the true nature of man's death and what follows, resurrection and ascension into his glorious life in God. This is what the Incarnation was to reveal, a truth that, unfortunately, most people do not believe is the way of their own life, but instead only the life of one man, Jesus. This wrong view, of course, totally misses Christ, universal man. While nothing is effected in a day, we can nevertheless point out many consequences of the Incarnation that have gradually seeped into society. The real influence of Christianity has never been by conversion, but by osmosis, comparable perhaps to the subtlety of a genetic mutation. The riches of the Incarnation have yet to be realized, uncovered, and articulated. As one father remarked, the Incarnation was the pivotal axis of the whole history of mankind, past and future, end quote. So, we have a ways to go before all its implications are fully realized. As much as we know at present is the tip of the iceberg. Obviously, the Incarnation far outreaches the narrow meaning given it by most Christians. In some cases, it was an extension of the truth of Judaic monotheism, as well as a correction of many false beliefs. Thus, it verified belief in resurrection and eliminated belief in metempsychosis, the Greek belief today pared down to reincarnation.